Just in case you've been living under a rock for the last 2 years and just re-emerged into the world of emulation, Nintendo has been on a tirade of sorts, suing ROM sites and emulator developers into the proverbial ground. Their tactics usually resort to draining opponents of resources through tireless litigation. And while you could argue that ROM sites were asking for it, the same cannot be said of those developers responsible for Yuzu and Ryujinx. After all, emulation has been and always will be legal, even if Nintendo argues that the developers breached some kind of conduct. Their software never included the firmware or product keys, which means that the big bully was always wrong. But it was never Nintendo's intention to win. They knew that protracted court cases would destroy those developers through astronomical legal fees, something that Nintendo could easily afford to drag out. Yuzu was first in the firing line since its developers were asking for donations from eager patrons. It's a technicality, but unfortunately, Nintendo used it to end the emulator once and for all. They could have simply demanded that all donations stopped, but the point was never to deny a few $1,000s to errant developers. However, what transpired with Ryujinx is a bit murky since we don't know exactly what had occurred. Apparently, its lead developer was approached by Nintendo's lawyers, and this is interesting because the company couldn't actually sue Ryujinx. It was made in Brazil, you see, a country that has very weak copyright laws. My guess is that a sum of money exchanged between the two parties. And if that's true, there's a high possibility that Nintendo actually bought the software, which means they own the patent now. But logically, that shouldn't be true, right? I mean, there's like half a dozen forks of Ryujinx out in the ether. Why would Nintendo allow these forks to exist if they owned the original code? To that, I cannot answer definitively, but I'm guessing because that wouldn't solve their problem. There are many forks of Yuzu as well, and while Ryujinx and its newer SKUs are generally better on PC, the proliferation of Switch emulation on Android has always been seen as a much greater threat. Imagine playing Breath of the Wild on a portable device that performs better than the original Switch. For a company like Nintendo, that's a potential nightmare, and judging by history alone, we can assume they'll try to do something about it. This might explain why Android phones and tablets will ban all sideloading in the near future, since most emulators are missing from Google's App Store. I'm not saying Nintendo had a hand in it, but even if they didn't, they clearly are going to benefit from this change. So, if Android is no longer an option, handheld PCs are probably going to start taking over. We've already seen it with the Steam Deck, but right now, major companies are gearing up to roll out powerful mini computers with decent battery life. Portable computers are more functional than Android devices anyway, with better multitasking. And they are not much more expensive than high-end phones, so Nintendo could potentially have an even bigger problem within a few years. So that brings us to the Switch 2. Will there ever be a working emulator? My guess is that someone is already working on it. The reason why we haven't heard anything is simple. The developers are probably going to wait until the Switch 2 is close to the end of its life cycle. The big mistake of Yuzu and Ryujinx was that they competed directly with real hardware. Seeing Switch games running better on a Steam Deck than Nintendo's own handheld completely broke people's minds. And as successful as the Switch ended up becoming, there is a legitimate argument that emulation harmed sales for Nintendo. Anybody who denies this is delusional. However, the company's biggest mistake was that it used outdated technology that could easily be replicated via emulation. And indeed, they haven't really learned their lesson. The Switch 2 is decent, but I can already see it becoming obsolete within 3 or 4 years. What makes it worse is that Nintendo tends to support old consoles way past their sell-by date. It was in the latter years of the Switch where we saw most defectors to emulation. Gamers were tired of playing at low frame rates and blurry resolutions. If the Switch 2 lasts longer than 6 years, this pattern will repeat itself. Resorting to de novo's DRM was probably the worst thing the company could have done because it only harms their own consumers. But maybe that's the crux of the matter. Nintendo doesn't care about consumers. They want absolute control at whatever cost. And this is all well and good when their consoles are selling like hotcakes. But what happens when their next handheld doesn't sell? It could spell the end of Nintendo if there's no goodwill left between them and consumers. The company is burning all of its bridges and might eventually pay the consequences. But what is your opinion on the matter? Have your say in the comments below, and maybe Nintendo will read them. In any case, thanks for watching and have a nice day.